Hello and welcome to I Know Dino. Keep up with the latest dinosaur discoveries and science with us. I'm Garrett.
And I'm Sabrina.
And today in our 495th episode, we have a bunch of news.
Including a new dinosaur, the oldest and first ornithopod named from Brazil.
Ooh.
And new to science is a new Archaeopteryx specimen that's on display at the Field Museum.
New to science, huh? Sounds like one of these things that was discovered and in a private collection, maybe?
Bingo.
Nice. Well, that's cool. We also have an interview with Tony and James Pinto, the creators of Why Dinosaurs, or at least a couple of them. And we have Dinosaur of the Day, Bradycneme. I think that's an alvarosaurid.
Well, now it's thought to be. At first it was thought to be an owl.
Oh, yeah. And of course, we have a fun fact. And it is the fact that dinosaurs have feathers is good evidence that they were warm-blooded. And I will explain how and why in the fun fact at the end. But before we get through all that good stuff, we want to thank some of our patrons. And this week we have 10 patrons to thank, and they are Sydney, Fernando, and his mom Maria, Linda, Dino Mo, David, Devin, Reed, Pachycelskisaurus, John Heck, and David.
Yes, thank you so much for being a dino-it-all.
Yeah, we appreciate all of our dino-it-alls. And as a quick reminder, everyone at the Triceratops tier and up gets the ad-free version of the show. So if you want to join and get a shout-out and get the show ad-free, you can do that at patreon.com/iknowdino.
And anyone who listens to this show can submit a question, which I think we forgot to mention at the beginning of the episode. We have a whole segment where we'll be answering a listener question.
Oh, that's true. I do have a couple listener questions.
But first, jumping into the news. As promised, we have a new dinosaur, specifically a new elasmarian ornithopod, Thietosaura derbiana. It was published by Camilla L.N. Bandera and others in Historical Biology, and it's open access if anyone wants to check that out. That'll link will be in the show notes. So many elasmarian ornithopods used to be known as hypsilophodonts. This clade of elasmarian ornithopods includes dinosaurs that lived in the Cretaceous in what is now South America, Antarctica, and Australia. As an elasmarian, Thietosaura would have walked on two legs, had a long body and tail, short arms, and a small short head. It's closely related to Notohypsilophodon, which lived in the late Cretaceous in Argentina, though this new ornithopod was found in what's now Brazil. And it kind of looked like the early dinosaurs with maybe a longer neck.
So small and bipedal and all that normal early dinosaur stuff.
Yeah. And what you would imagine a formerly known as hypsilophodont looked like. I didn't really see a size estimate for Thietosaura, but Notohypsilophodon is estimated to be about 1 to 2 meters or over 3 to over 6 feet long. So Thietosaura was a small dinosaur. It had unique grooves and depressions and a distinct crest on the femur. The reason I bring all this up is because the holotype only includes part of a left thigh bone, specifically the distal end.
Oh, I was going to ask something about where it's teeth like Hypsilophodon, because that's the famous thing. But if it's only a partial femur, not going to know much about its mouth or really much about it in general at all.
Yes. And that's why I'm saying think of these other dinosaurs.
Mm-hmm.
The partial left femur is about 23 centimeters or about 9 inches long. The fossil was found at a beach. And it represents the first dinosaur bones collected from South America because there were fossils collected between 1859 and 1906 in northeast Brazil in the state of Bahia, which is far east. It touches the Atlantic Ocean, that state. These fossils are from the early Cretaceous. They weren't described at the time. Most of them were considered lost, but some of them were rediscovered at the Natural History Museum of London, where they had been housed. And those specimens actually came from 5 different sites. They're bones from ornithopods, sauropods, and theropods. They were fragmentary, but the authors said, quote, represent the earliest dinosaur bones discovered in South America, end quote. And that includes this partial femur that now represents this new ornithopod.
Wow, that's cool. We kind of buried the lead on that one. New name for the oldest fossils ever found in South America.
That's true. I guess I was really focused on this being a new dinosaur, and also it has it's gone through a few iterations of what it was classified as, because at the Natural History Museum it was labeled as Hipposaurus species. That's a crocodiliform known from the Late Cretaceous in what's now North America, North Africa, and Brazil. So very different. The authors, though, they found it to be an elasmarian ornithopod based on several characters, differences in the grooves and depressions and the dimensions. They weren't able to do histology on the bone to see how old this dinosaur was, but there's signs that it was mature, like having some smooth surfaces that usually have dimple patterns in younger specimens of other animals, including pterosaurs, ceratopsians, and birds. But there's no way to know for sure at this time if this dinosaur was an adult or how old it was.
I see. So kind of like how on our teeth, we have little ridges on our teeth, and as we get older, they get worn down and worn a little smoother. They think the same was going on with the skeleton of this animal, but you can't compare it because you don't have the young one. So you don't know if it was bumpy originally. We're just like, some animals have these bumps, so maybe it had those.
One small bone.
Yeah, they're doing what they can.
Yes. And who knows, maybe more finds will come up later and more information can come out. That'd be cool. But this find confirms that there were ornithischians in Brazil. Ornithischians, for reference, they're the bird-hipped dinosaurs, mostly herbivores. They're not as closely related to birds and their cousins. The birds and their cousins are also known as the lizard-hipped dinosaurs, aka saurischians, which include theropods and sauropods. I suppose the ornithischians and saurischians, it depends how you, what labels you use when you're classifying.
I don't even like saurischians.
Yeah. Anyway, but we'll just stick to the ornithischians. This one is an ornithischian. And before this find, the ornithischians in the area, quote, the occurrences were scarce and most of them doubtful, end quote. For example, there was a supposed iguanodontian bone that was later thought to be a spinosaurid rib. So yeah, it's just hard to tell sometimes. But there do seem to be a lot of tracks that show that there were ornithischians in the area. So this new dinosaur, the genus name Tietosaura, comes from Tieta, a nickname for Antonieta in Portuguese. And the author said, quote, the name Tieta honors the main character from the homonymous novel Tieta do Agresta by the famous author Jorge Amado, who was born in Bahia and lived in Salvador City. The name Antonieta further means priceless, alluding the value of Tietosaura as the first nominal ornithischian species from Brazil, end quote.
Yeah. So even if there are other bones that become known from Ornithischia in the future, this is the first one that got named.
Yes, even though it took a long time to get named because the fossils were found in the 1800s, early 1900s. The species name, Derbiana, is in honor of Orville A. Derby, quote, founder and the first director from Brazilian Mineralogical and Geological Commission, being also the former director of the National Museum of the Rio de Janeiro and one of the pioneers of paleontology in the Reconcavo Basin, which is where the fossil's from. Despite all tragedies in his life and the blatant lack of governmental support, Derby valiantly fought for the scientific progress of the Brazilian geosciences, end quote. Some pretty big shoes to fill based on these names.
that the dinosaur needs to fill?
Yeah.
Well, they would have big shoes because they have those big long toes. So.
Well, we better find its feet.
I guess so.
And just to kind of round this out, some other animals that lived around the same time and place as Tietosaura include mollusks, sharks, fish, crocodiles, plesiosaurs, and pterosaurs. It's a lot of marine life. Before we get to our listener questions, I've got some quick news items. The Field Museum in Chicago has a new to science Archaeopteryx on display. It's called the Chicago Archaeopteryx, and it's new to the public. It sounds like a really cool display. I know some of our listeners have already visited and taken pictures. So, thank you for sharing those, because it's going to be a while till we can make it to the Field Museum. This specimen was found sometime before 1990 by a private fossil collector, and it's been in private collections since 1990. And that's important because of the way the laws are in terms of the reason why this specimen of Archaeopteryx is allowed to be outside of Europe.
Oh, I see, yeah. It made it in before it was illegal to export them, basically?
Yes. A group of people helped the Field Museum to get it, and it got to the museum back in August of 2022, and then the museum had to prepare it, which is the exciting part. When they did the x-ray of the slab, they saw that it was a nearly complete skeleton.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. And Jingmei O'Connor is already studying the skeleton. They've got new details on the skull. I think I read something like they've submitted 3 papers already about it, and they've got more on the way. It's the most complete, best preserved Archaeopteryx found so far.
Wow.
Yeah. And so now it's on display in a temporary exhibit at the Field Museum. There's also this animated 3D projection showing how Archaeopteryx would have looked when it's alive. And in the fall, it's going to be part of a permanent exhibit opening.
Wow. Man, that Field Museum.
Yeah.
They've got one of the most complete T-Rex and largest of all time. Now they've got one of the most, I'm going to say, complete Archaeopteryx, because I want to see a peer review on whether or not that holds up as most complete, because people sometimes get a little overzealous with their claims when they get a new fossil.
I think it's because it's got the most details of the skull that we know.
Oh, yeah, that's really important.
Yeah. But yeah, I'm interested in, we'll be looking out for those papers.
Mm-hmm.
One more quick cool thing. Maybe I should have brought this up because it's related to Brazil. Before we talked about Chicago, but anyway, the National Museum of Brazil got a donation of over 1,100 fossils, and all those fossils were found in Brazil.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah,
that's a lot of fossils.
It is, especially for this museum that in 2018 there was a fire that destroyed about 85% of its artifacts. They had about 20 million of them.
Yeah.
So this Swiss-German collector, Burkhard Pohl, donated 1,104 fossils to the museum. We've got one of the world's biggest fossil collections. These fossils are from formations that are 115 to 110 million years old, and they include 2 dinosaurs, probably some small raptors, which they'll be studied.
I guess 1,100 fossils is kind of a drop in the bucket compared to losing over 10 million, but gotta start somewhere.
You do, and I like that there's some new dinosaurs in the mix.
Yes.
The museum's expected to open again in April of 2026.
Oh, that's nice. That's the first time hearing of a new opening date.
Mm-hmm.
And in just a moment, I'll get into our listener feedback, but first we're going to pause for a quick sponsor break. All right, now on to our listener feedback, and I'm going to start off with a very easy question from Paul. He asked, have you ever had the basal sauropodomorph Pampodromius as the dino of the day? And the quick answer is, we haven't. The long answer is, if you go to iknowdino.com, there is a button on the top labeled episodes, which lists all of the dinosaurs of the day and all of the guests that we've had for every episode that we've ever done. It's just a big old table. That's where I went to do a quick search, and Pampodromius is not on the list. Sometimes we have covered new dinosaurs as news items, and then we try to wait a little bit to do them as a dinosaur of the day. But Pampodromius was actually named in 2011, so we hadn't quite started the podcast yet. So we haven't covered it as news either. And Pampodromius looks very interesting. It's an early sauropodomorph from the Triassic, probably a little over 230 million years old. And it looks like we actually have a decent skeleton to work with in terms of figuring out what it looked like, a lot more than just part of a femur. So if you or anyone else wants to request Pampodromius, there is a channel in our Discord server where patrons can request dinosaurs of the day. It's called Dinosaur Requests.
Yep. Pampodromius sounds like an interesting one.
On the topic of sauropods, Ryan the biochemist asked a much less simple question.
A more in-depth question?
Yes. They asked, I have a reasonably clear mental image of how different ornithischians differ from each other, but in my head, sauropods all are very samey, and so are theropods, even though I know that's not really true. Could you list a few examples of subgroups of each and their distinguishing features? And yes, I can.
All right, let's hear it.
I first want to agree that ornithischians do have the most obvious differences. I think everyone can tell the difference between a Stegosaurus and a Triceratops. They tend to have these big showy features.
Yep, Stegosaurus plates and the spikes on the tail, and then Triceratops, the big frill, and of course the 3 horns on the face.
Yes, and there's a lot of other ornithischian groups too with pretty standout features. But for sauropods, I'd say there are basically 4 groups to keep in mind. There's the early sauropodomorphs like Plateosaurus and Pampodromius, apparently. Just throwing that one back in.
Apparently we need to do that as a dinosaur of the day, then we'll know more.
Yes. These were mostly bipedal. Their necks weren't that impressive yet. They were on the small side. Most of them were probably omnivores. And you can think of them as just sort of generic little bipedal animals without a lot of showy features. Certainly nothing like a Stegosaurus, more like a big Compsognathus or something that you'd really see as more of a theropod type body plan. That's what the sauropodomorphs, the very early ones, looked like. But there are two major, more recent, and I almost want to say modern groups.
The modern sauropods.
Yeah.
Like the modern tyrannosaurs.
Yeah. I think modern might be defensible in this case because technically they're joined in one group called Neosauropoda, which basically means new sauropods.
Mm.
They're not really that new.
And they're all gone.
Yes. I mean, they've been gone for 66 million years. But even when they first evolved, the group evolved in the early or middle Jurassic over 170 million years ago. They're still new compared to the first sauropodomorphs, which were over 230 million years ago. So, at least 60 million years into the evolution of sauropodomorphs. But I usually think of Neosauropoda in terms of the two main subsets. There's Diplodocus and Macronarians. So Diplodocus include Diplodocus or Diplodocus. They mostly had long whip-like tails. That's sort of the key feature of Diplodocids and Diplodocus. Sabrina's favorite Apatosaurus and or Brontosaurus are also Diplodocus.
Yeah, they are.
Some of them were extremely large, like Supersaurus. And in addition to the whip-like tails, many Diplodocus have a pair of spines on their neck and or back vertebrae. And Amargasaurus, for example, is a Diplodocoid. So usually their spines on their vertebrae didn't stick up out of their back, and you would never even know they were there if they were covered in flesh. But in the case of Amargasaurus, we think it stuck up out of the back and created a pair of sails.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just sort of an extreme example of that feature.
There's always an extreme example in dinosaurs.
Yes. In addition to those whip-like tails, Diplodocoids also had the fastest tooth replacement rates of any dinosaurs. Nigersaurus had 5 or 6 replacement teeth growing at a time behind each tooth that was in use. The handy thing about that is a tooth still takes many months to grow, but if you have 5 or 6 of them sort of stacked up growing, when that first one's starting, that one that's next in line has already had quite a few months to grow. Some dicraeosaurids replaced the smaller teeth in the front of their mouth as often as every 20 days.
Ooh.
I think the larger teeth farther back in the mouth could take up to like 40 days. So, not nearly as impressive as every 20 days. There are a lot of other differences in the bones with Diplodocoids, but those to me are the big differences that stand out. You don't have to be an anatomist to notice those details. The other quote-unquote new sauropods are the Macronarians. They include Camarasaurus, Brachiosaurus, and all of the Titanosaurs. Some of those dinosaurs are incredibly large. Speaking of individuals like Patagotitan.
Mm-hmm. I always think of the Patagotitan on display at the American Museum of Natural History where it doesn't even fit in the room.
Yeah,
it's so large.
In a very large room. Yeah, most Macronarians have shorter hind limbs than forelimbs, or basically arms, which tends to give them a more upright neck than Diplodocoids. So you can think of like the Brachiosaurus that you see in Jurassic Park. It's got those longer front limbs that really angles its back up, and then the neck sort of continues that orientation. Because of that more upright pose, I think they're what most people think of as a typical sauropod. Most cartoon sauropods, I would say, are unspecified Macronarians.
Yeah, like Gertie.
Yeah, any of the ones that sort of angle up. Actually, I think Gertie is a little more horizontal. I don't know what Gertie would be. I get maybe a Titanosaur. It's got a pretty wide stance, but we might be overthinking those cartoons a little bit. Macronarians didn't replace their teeth nearly as quickly as Diplodocoids, but their teeth were generally larger and stronger. I shouldn't say nearly as quickly. They still replace their teeth pretty quickly. With Camarasaurus, for example, they replace their teeth about once every 2 months.
Yeah, that's pretty frequent.
Yeah. And Macronarian teeth are often described as spatulate or spoon-like or even chisel-shaped, whereas Diplodocoids, sometimes they're described as pencil-like, or in some of the later ones like Nigersaurus, they're so tiny I wouldn't even describe them as pencil-like. They're more like little pegs. Many of the later macronarians, aka titanosaurs, had a, quote, wide-gauged posture, also known as a wide-legged stance. Basically, their chest was wider, which put their feet farther apart and gave them this wider stance, and you can see that in their trackways as well. Saltosaurus is also a macronarian. That's the sauropod famous for its osteoderms. Sometimes it's also depicted with a tail club, but that is pretty speculative. I think recently I've been a little too optimistic about that tail club possibility. But I guess it's a possibility. More importantly, it had osteoderms, which is cool. And again, there are a lot of other subtle differences that you can find with macronarians, but those are the obvious ones, I would say. And then one last group I want to mention is the Mamenchisaurids.
The long, long necks.
Yeah, and I think that's what they're most famous for, is those really long necks. Sometimes I describe Mamenchisaurids as like a reverse Diplodocus, since its neck was extremely long, but its tail was a little bit shorter. They evolved before macronarians. They actually showed up in the early Jurassic and went extinct in the early Cretaceous, so they didn't last as long as the macronarians. Diplodocoids might have made it a little bit longer, but not quite as long as macronarians, so the macronarians were the latest of the sauropods, as titanosaurs. Some Mamenchisaurids, like Omesaurus, may have also had osteoderms and a small tail club. The most famous tail clubbed dinosaur, Shunosaurus, doesn't fit into any of those four groups neatly.
But it's got that tail club. That's pretty cool.
Yes.
Good summary of sauropods.
And I realized I didn't even get into the theropods. I guess I'll leave that for another week. I feel like all that detail about sauropods is probably enough for 1 week. And if anybody else has a question or feedback for us, you can go to bit.ly/dino questions. So bit.ly/dino questions. I'm not going to spell out all of questions, all lowercase. And that'll take you to a simple Google form where you can ask us whatever you're wondering about dinosaurs. And now we're going to pause for one last sponsor break. And we're just doing it a little bit early so we don't have to interrupt the interview, but we'll be right back after a quick sponsor break. And now on to our interview with Tony and James Pinto. And I want to mention, we've had a few people wondering what the easiest way to jump ahead to after the interview is, if you're listening to the extended version of the interview, because again, there is an extended version of this interview available. And the way to do that is at the bottom of the description of the extended interview, there is a timestamp for when the ad-free episode resumes after the interview. So you can use that to jump ahead to the ad-free spot. Unfortunately, because the ads vary in length, we can't give an exact timestamp for the non-ad-free episode, but it's probably just a minute or two later. So that'll give you a rough approximation of where it resumes.
Yes, and if you want to listen to the extended interviews, any of our extended interviews, then make sure you join our community at patreon.com/iknowdino.
So without further ado, we're going to get on to that interview with Tony and James Pinto. So we're joined this week by Tony and James, who are the father and son team behind the feature-length documentary Why Dinosaurs. If their names sound familiar, they've been on our show twice before. If this is the first time you're hearing them, Tony is a filmmaker and the director and producer of Why Dinosaurs and the father of the father-son team. And James is graduating from UC Berkeley with a degree in integrative biology and geology, and he's applying to grad schools as we speak. So thank you both very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Again.
Yes.
Yeah.
Always a pleasure. So Why Dinosaurs? It was 6 years in the making, and then you had your Hollywood premiere. And can we say it's done now? It's ready to be out in the world.
No, it's ready to be out in the world, but it's not done. We did have a screening. Every time we screen it, we get lots of great feedback from people, and I'm a perfectionist. I want it to be as good as it can be. Some people feel it's a tad long, so we're trying to tighten things up and just make it as good as it can be. But it may end up being the version that's you guys have seen, because you came to LA. that may be the sort of director's cut, but it's very possible there'll be a shorter version. And then, we're pursuing a broadcast with PBS, and they have a very hard, 55-minute cutoff. And so we're trying to sort of shoehorn it into a 55-minute as well. And also considering breaking it into a limited series, because apparently nobody can sit and watch anything for 90 minutes straight anymore. Unless it's a 6-part, 4-hour series, then no problem.
We get into this all the time. I always want to watch movies. Sabrina always wants to watch TV shows. But if it's a half-hour TV show and there's 10 episodes, we can watch all 10 back to back, and that's okay.
I can't explain it.
It is completely psychological, but we have run into it so often that I'm like, fine, make it a series or make it 60 minutes. I don't care. Just let's pick one and go with it.
So you're going to run into a situation where it needs to be simultaneously much shorter to fit 55 minutes and much longer so that you can do 300 minutes split up.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm all for it. Yeah, we could expand it. We have 30 plus hours of content that we didn't use. So it could be expanded as a series, but a lot of different possibilities in the works, I'll say.
Yeah.
That's exciting.
Yeah, we really enjoyed, because you guys invited us to the Hollywood premiere, which was super cool.
Mm-hmm.
We had no idea what to expect from that. And we're like, Hollywood premiere, that sounds fancy. And it was extremely fancy.
Red carpet, fancy hors d'oeuvres. Got to meet a lot of people face to face that we'd only talked to through screens before. It was really cool.
Yeah, that was great.
That's awesome. Yeah, we're really glad you guys could come. And it had taken so long to put this out. We figured the least we could do is throw a big party and, invite all our friends. And so it was a fun time for sure.
It was. And I know you made a whole weekend out of it. How does it feel having gone through this multi-year journey together?
Yeah, because you started before college, right? It was like
middle school?
It was high school, right? With the
it was like early high school. I mean, there's parts of this. It's footage, obviously, in the movie that's from middle school and before even. And I think that even during that time, the seed was kind of in my dad's brain of like, I should be documenting this for something. I don't know exactly what, but this will be something. And that was where a lot of like why we have so much footage of some of the science fair projects and things I did in middle school, because it was always just there, this like vague nugget of, oh, hey, isn't this stuff kind of interesting? But we only really started working on it, I think, when I was 15, and I'm almost 22 now. So.
Yeah, because wasn't the original idea like getting more input onto whether or not your degree should be related to paleontology? So you'd ask people why they're into paleontology, and it would sort of help you form ideas about what your career might be. Is that right?
I think the idea was sort of why, like just to see what the actual landscape of people who were interested in dinosaurs was. The original idea that I had, because I was actually the one that sort of first pitched like, oh, we should do some video or something, is just looking historically, like if you track the record of pop cultural sort of brands or other ideas or whatever, like where do dinosaurs come into the picture and why do they like so quickly eclipse all other, at the time I was thinking prehistoric animals, but really more largely just natural things as this like larger than life sort of character in the public eye. And so part of it was just about that. I was curious as to why that was the case. And then the other half was, I was sort of from the outside familiar with the idea of like, oh, well, people work on dinosaurs, but I didn't really know all the different ways that you could or how getting involved with any of that worked. And so that was sort of a good opportunity to go through a lot of the different scenarios of like, oh, what are, because there's like 10 different ways or more that people can be into dinosaurs, quote unquote, make it either their job or their hobby or some other aspect of their life. And it's a lot of options.
Yeah.
Did making this documentary get you more into paleontology, like kind of steered you more towards this as a career? Or do you think you always would have done it?
It's interesting because I'll kind of, let the cat out of the bag here just so that it can color the rest of the session. In terms of my actual research, I don't really work on dinosaurs.
Oh, that's right. Yes. That's why I said paleontology.
No. And I that's true, certainly. But I think it's interesting given this whole thing that I went through. And part of that was an influence from, my time at Berkeley and sort of talking with advisors about what things sort of best help with the questions I have. Because a lot of what I'm interested in is just like where odd morphologies come from, especially when there's features that you think would make no sense in terms of natural selection, like big sailbacks and other sorts of things that might be sexually selected or might have some other motivating factor. But I think that like initial roulette of just like running around museums all over the place and looking at fossils all the time and talking to people in very relatively short order kind of made me want to go broad. So I think that's probably how it influenced me the most. Is it was a really nice way to kind of expand my view.
Nice.
Gotcha.
Tony, for you, did this change anything for you? I know this is your first documentary. Do you plan on doing more documentaries?
Yeah, I loved the whole experience, really. And I'm loving the experience I'm having now as producer trying to like get it out there, which is totally different than making the film. As somebody had told me, they were like, making the film's the easy part. And I was like, what? What are you talking about? And that's no joke. Like, just getting people to take you seriously, even just to look at the film, is tricky, when you don't have a track record. And so just learning about all that stuff, I'm like, this is what I would love to do for the rest of my career. I mean, I'll keep my day job, my corporate video. That's served us really well. But if I can do some of this stuff that's a little bit more on the creative side, where I get to choose the topic, then I'm all for it. And of course, being able to spend, so many years with James talking about the film, probably way more than he ever thought he would have to talk about it or want to talk about it, has been amazing. Now we're dabbling in film festivals and PBS broadcasts and having conversations with big streamers and small streamers. And it's just like, it's everything I ever wanted to do in the film industry. So yeah, this has just been amazing for me too.
That's great.
Yeah, and we haven't really talked that much about the documentary itself, but Sabrina and I both really enjoyed it, and especially how in the beginning it was sort of all the different ways that people work with dinosaurs and like why dinosaurs are important. But I feel like because we saw a version or two before the premiere too, it seemed to have added this sort of not just documentary about James and Tony and dinosaurs as an interest, but it has very much the quality of a dinosaur documentary in that like the state of the science, because you're talking to a lot of experts in different fields, and like you're talking to Alida Bayuel about some of the molecular stuff that you can find in dinosaur fossils, and then you're going over and talking to somebody else about general evolutionary things and just all the different aspects of it. And it was a very good overview of the state of the science, and also very inclusive with all the different types of scientists that get involved in dinosaur research. So I really enjoyed that. And I think people that already appreciate, we know why dinosaurs, like we love dinosaurs, but there's still like something interesting in there for everybody.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's really, we're walking a fine line between the entertainment and the education, right? When we screen it to dino nerds, and I'm allowed to call them that because I'm one, they can gobble up all the science. They want to hear about something, that they may not be aware of. And even we want this to be inspiring to future scientists, for young people that are, just getting into the sciences. And you don't want to totally water it down and make it all about Jurassic Park and people who sit on, Sinclair dinosaurs and whatnot. But when we have a more general audience view, they're like, I'm falling asleep at about 60 minutes in, and I already heard about how to find a dinosaur and how to clean a dinosaur and how to, research a dinosaur. And so it's so tough to find that balance between these two groups, and obviously the non-dinosaur nerd audience is a lot bigger. And so we could have a lot of influence there, but we don't want to disappoint the dinosaur nerds either, So you gotta walk this line, and it's really tricky, but we do want it to be an educational film.
Yeah. I obviously we're the dinosaur nerds, but I feel like you did a good job of walking that line, because I thought you were going to say, Garrett, about in terms of like the storyline, because there's a lot of dinosaur science in there. You interviewed so many amazing people, and there's like so many great shots in there, but it's also very much a story of the two of you and seeing you, James, grow up. And I think we told you this at the premiere. We very much have the parent feels these days now that we are parents. I was like,
yes.
Oh, James, you grew up. You were going to school, and wow.
The father-son through line of how sweet it is that Tony is going along with James's interests and that interplay, and how you see it develop throughout the movie from, I got this cool dinosaur toy, basically, to like, I'm at a science fair doing my first scientific question and hypothesis testing, all the way up to like, okay, I'm going to go to college and this is where I'm going. And now you could almost have,
you could make a sequel.
Add another 4 years of college to it and be like, now I'm going to grad school. But
maybe that's your limited series. You just each phase that you go through.
On.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it was great when you were talking about where you want to go with your research, and what you see with people that are really dedicated to the questions they're trying to answer. They have these questions in mind, and then a new tool comes out and they're like, I bet I could use that. And so it gets lumped in, like with CT scanning or something. I was looking back at the history of CT scanning at some point. It didn't take very long for a paleontologist to get a hold of a CT scanner in like the medical department of their university and shove a fossil in there, because it's just, everybody has that passion for like figuring out these difficult to answer questions, and every new tool just gets brought in, and then people end up learning all sorts of complicated statistics or whatever they need to learn in order to help answer the questions. So yeah.
I mean, I know more about coding than I ever thought that I would when I was going into school. But, that's just the stuff that you got to do. And it also helps to start wrapping your head around like these big processes, because, deep time is difficult to think about. That's one thing. So is, I think, the like large space, the scales that are involved in some of these processes. Because if you're talking about whole species and populations, or geologic features, sediment basins being established, mountain building events, all these things, not only do they take forever, but they're so big that you can like barely even consider them as one human. Yeah. And so we need a lot of help, I think, just to kind of reckon with all of that. And that's definitely, both in the large direction and in the small direction, which is where a lot of that CT scanning as well as histology comes in. I actually used both of those methods in a project I've been working on for my honors thesis, about basically through a combination of chopping up some new bones and scanning some bones and looking through old, contacts and collections and things, we've compiled an internal bone structure database of every sail-backed or hump-backed animal sort of evolution instance through time.
Wow.
Nice.
Which includes a lot of different groups. You've got like stem mammals like Dimetrodon and Edaphosaurus, but there's a number of dinosaurs that do it too, like Spinosaurus famously. There's sort of crocodilian relative called Arizonosaurus that does it. There are multiple groups of lizards that do it. And then, you've got mammals like bison and stuff that they don't have the sail, but they have neural spines that are that long. And so that's been a project, I think, where it's been a fun chance to just throw methods at something and really get at a question in terms of like, okay, well, functionally, what are these for? That's the big thing. But even just sort of getting to that. What can we describe about how their structure differs in terms of where the musculature might be and where the vasculature might be and all these different sort of anatomical things. So yeah, I think that's the other cool thing with paleo is your timescales can be, very sort of wide ranging, but your spatial scales can be too. You can be looking at the microscopic and the global in the same discipline.
That's very true.
And how it ranges across so many, like you're saying, you're looking at sails across mammals and dinosaurs and all kinds of animals, but they all have these things in common. And it's just so interesting that it evolved so many times.
Yeah, where did you draw the line too on like what a sail is and a hump versus just like a slightly taller than usual neural spine?
It was sort of a matter of, the easiest like quantifiable thing is neural spine length compared to centrum length in a vertebra. So, if you have a spine that's so many times longer than your vertebra, and generally I think everything that we looked at was about, I think it was like an 8-to-1 ratio. Like neural spines are at least 8 times longer than the centrum. But there's other things that it was also just a matter of what we could look at. There's some material like Acrocanthosaurus where there's one of them, nobody wants to cut it up. Like, what are you going to do? So
that was exactly the one I was thinking of, actually, was Acrocanthosaurus.
yeah. And stuff like that's interesting, right? But it's a matter of what you can do. And so it's been like this monumental, like the first 6 months at least of the project were just wrangling together all of the things. We got really lucky that we were able to work on what's basically the only Arizonasaurus. Hilariously, we had it loaned to some scanning facilities in USC, and so we got to take Arizonasaurus out of Arizona. And also, partially thanks to film connections, actually, that made Spinosaurus easier because we had been working with Nazar Ibrahim, but I had also been working with Matteo Fabri, who's at Chicago now, and he was sort of the instigator of a lot of that histological work on Spinosaurus and also on Ouranosaurus to some extent.
Nice. And
then, luckily, there's a good number of Dimetrodons and Edaphosaurs floating about, so that has been a little easier to do, but it was a matter of getting in touch with the people who work on those things. It's a whole different cast of characters. And so it's interesting because even stuff like that sort of wraps back around to what the film ended up being, which is just like, hey, let's just talk to a bunch of people and wrangle together a bunch of ideas and see what sort of larger picture we can get about something. So I think that sort of spirit of collaboration hopefully remains alive in what I do, but it's been a big part of the movie too.
Yeah. And like you were saying, in the early days of Why Dinosaurs, and you're interviewing these like big names, it was the same thing we found when we started our podcast, which is basically like these people are so passionate and so willing to talk about their work, and they're not picky, they're not like, oh, you're not National Geographic, or, oh, you don't have this like huge brand name, I'm not going to like waste my time. It's such a cool community. Every time we interact, like even go into your premiere, everybody's so open, everybody's so nice, and it's just like such a welcoming group. I love getting as involved as I can into it. Is always enjoyable.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I'm still blown away. James would go out and reach out to these folks. I'd say, hey, I have a commercial job in Vancouver, could you see if there's somebody to interview? And he'd come back, with Scott Sampson. So, he said we could come interview him. And it was just like, for me at the time, it was like, well, who's that? James would show me. And I'm like, whoa, that's big. And then once we met these folks and they kind of could see that James was the real deal and we weren't out to exploit anyone, then, Scott Sampson would be like, well, who else do you want to meet? You want to meet Phil Curry? You want to meet, we were like, Jack Horner. And he's like, well, if you can find him. And it did take us a long time to track Jack down. But then finally we did. And he said yes, like immediately. And we were like, oh, well, that was easy. It's just a wonderful wonderful community. I just love the people, in paleontology. They're great people.
Yes.
Dinosaur lovers in general.
It almost sounds like throughout the process, Tony, you've gotten more into dinosaurs and James has pivoted into mammals.
Well, that's mostly true. But I do remember a time when James was sort of like, well, I'm interested in art and music and, dinosaurs and this and that. And correct me if I'm wrong, James, but I remember saying, man, if I knew so much about something as you do that young, that early in life, I said, you could be like the Tiger Woods of, paleontology, like just lean into it, double down, do paleontology. You could be a world expert. And I don't know if he listened to that advice or not, but he did move in that direction. So
I don't remember the Tiger Woods metaphor.
Oh, of course you don't. Yeah,
but
it happened. It happened.
However,
that's fine. No. James is very independent, very hardworking individual. Has never wanted to be defined by this movie, and the opportunities that he's had, and so he frequently goes out and tries to defy connections with the movie and the people he knows, and just try to be in the community on his own merits, which I can really respect. It's a great thing, and obviously he's done well along those lines. So,
James, what was your first paper about?
It was sort of this interesting collaboration project that spurned out of bumping into the right person at Berkeley's museum collections where I work. So essentially it's a description paper of a new genus of a group of stem mammals called dicynodonts. And the sort of claim to fame with this animal is it's the first dicynodont described in North America in over 100 years.
Oh, wow.
Of research. There was 2 species that were both published in very short order in 1904 and 1908 by Williston and Lucas, actually, who are people who worked with Barnum Brown and stuff. So really old days paleo people. And then nothing for 110 or so years. And those animals are from the sort of American Southwest, and their record is really, really lopsided. We have a couple records of, one of those animals is known from one bone. So, great. And then the other animal is known from one sort of population of 40 individuals that all sort of died together or maybe attritionally kind of piled up, but were found in the same bone bed in Arizona, kind of near a petrified forest. And this new animal that we have is actually from the Dockham group in Texas. So it extends the range of them out east quite a bit, and also extends their temporal range back quite a bit. It's a few million years older than any of the ones that we had known of before. The name of the actual genus is Argodicynodon, but it was sort of an odd project, and it was really nice to get it out because the person who had originally started working on that material was a Texas Tech PhD student who unfortunately passed away before they could finish the publication. And so they're still first author, but sort of in honor of that, a couple of other people, me, a researcher at USC, and some people at Texas kind of came together and finished that project. So it was really cool to be able to kind of bring that forward and, vindicate, he'd been working on that for I think almost 10 years or something.
Wow.
Between a master's and a PhD and everything. So it was nice to be able to kind of put a button on it.
Yeah.
But it's probably just the beginning. I'll say, without specifics, there are multiple other species in that group in multiple other parts of the continent that remain to be published, sort of whispers at the time. But the reason that I had started getting interested in that group of animals was actually because of the other paper, which is about using the population from the species that was known from, 40 or so individuals to establish one of the oldest examples of a sexually dimorphic feature in a vertebrate in the fossil record.
Wow.
So, these are animals that are from the late Triassic. So about the time that the first dinosaurs are showing up. And they have this sort of, it's in the place where a tusk would be, but it's really more similar to a horn. And it's, what started as kind of this observation when people were finding the material was like, oh, hey, some of them have big horns and some of them have small horns. And this is kind of weird. I was like, oh, that's interesting. I wonder if sexual dimorphism is at play. And if so, can we actually prove it, as well as you can? And so a lot of statistics later, using a couple of sort of likelihood arguments and morphometric analyses, we found like pretty good evidence that not only is that part dimorphic, but other parts of the skeleton aren't. And so it's sort of like, one of these, what's called a secondary sexual characteristic, where some deer with bigger horns or bovids with larger horns, whatever, one sex of these animals is evolving this much larger version of the feature than the other, and probably using them to, hit heads or show off at each other or whatever exactly the behavior is. But it's happening, 150 plus million years before any mammals actually really invest in that. And it's bizarrely similar to what we see in those modern groups. And so the fact that it kind of came out, and then came back is really interesting, I think, in my mind. And also the fact that you see it there much more apparently than you do in something like a dinosaur. Because that's one really interesting, if you ask a lot of paleontologists, like, oh, what's a big dinosaur conundrum? It's why aren't dinosaurs obviously sexually dimorphic? Why do so many of them have these wacko features that you really want to say are for sexual selection, but appear in all the individuals? Triceratops is a really good example, or any of the other ceratopsians, really, where, the frill and the horns for some extent would be for defense, but especially with the really elaborate ceratopsian horns, it's like, what is the point of this? Like, clearly there must be something else happening. And yet for some of those groups, there's like many individuals and none of them are sort of the hornless variety or whatever you would have. So that kind of question, I think, especially because a lot of the stem mammals are, as research like mine is sort of putting out, sexually dimorphic in more clearly diagnosable ways. So what is that sort of disconnect? Did dinosaurs just live like very differently from our big mammals? Was the way that they interacted just that different that maybe all of their dimorphic features were in their skin or in their feathers, and none of it was really reflected in their bone structure? But it's a question that includes dinosaurs, right? But it's just about animals, really.
Yeah.
Like, where is this coming from more fundamentally?
I can see how you're interested in birds then too, because with most, or a lot of birds, not most birds, I'm not confident enough to say that, you have like the color difference is the main thing, sometimes size, but there are some where they have a big bony, like I think hornbills, right? Like the males have like a bigger
casque.
Yeah, exactly. So you could see that in the fossil record. But yeah, you're right. We don't really see it. It does help that you have 40 of those too to compare, because that's not something you get with dinosaurs very often.
Not always, but we've got at least 50 Triceratops.
That's true. Yeah.
And it also helped that we knew that they were all from the same place and they're all about the same age. And it makes it a lot, because some of the time with changes in especially dinosaurs, like if you don't have a really good idea of where they're all exactly from, oftentimes you'll get is it, anagenesis? Is it like change over time in a population that is just being reduced to what looks like a simultaneous one, but actually was living over millions of years?
Yeah.
But birds is also, it's another really interesting group, especially because birds kind of act as this possible proof for the idea of that skin deep dimorphism. One of the best fossil populations of a bird that we have is Confuciusornis. And one of the best examples of plumage-based dimorphism we have in the fossil record is Confuciusornis. One sex of them has these big tail feathers and the others don't. And so I think if we had a lot more feathered dinosaurs or something of some of these bigger groups, or we knew what colors they were more clearly, it's entirely possible, that you'd have a bunch of different sort of bird-like sexual differences that popped up as they were getting these weird display features as well.
Yeah.
It's really interesting to think about. Yeah, I never really thought of it that way before.
Once these papers are published, we're going to have to talk to you more. Or we'll just talk to you periodically for your whole career, hopefully.
Yeah, this is way above my pay grade. So. I'm out.
Well, then I've got one for you, Tony. For our listeners, if they want to keep up with Why Dinosaurs, and especially when you announce where the screenings are going to be and everything like that, where's the best place for them to follow you?
Yes, whydinosaurs.com or Instagram. That's our primary social media account, Why Dinosaurs. We will share as much and as frequently as we can. We'd love to see as many people as we can out of these screenings this summer.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for joining us. It's always fantastic catching up.
Yes, and congratulations on all the many milestones.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I look forward to telling you when we're actually done editing the film. That'll be a fun milestone too.
Great.
It's coming. Anyway, thank you guys so much. Really, it's always a blast.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony and James, for taking the time to chat with us. It's always fun to catch up and hear what's going on. We recorded our interview a couple months ago now, and since then, as a quick update, James has graduated UC Berkeley and has accepted a graduate fellowship in geosciences at USC, as well as a research grant from the National Science Foundation to further his studies in paleontology. So congratulations, James. And a number of our listeners have asked us where they can see Why Dinosaurs. The good news is you can now watch the film at a number of live events this year. We'll have a link in our show notes there. Keep an updated list. The next few are in the UK.
Yeah, they're going to be on May 31st at London's Crystal Palace with the Crystal Palace dinosaurs. Super cool. Then on June 1st, they're going to be in Sheffield, UK. And then on June 5th, they'll be at the Bristol Aquarium in the UK. And then finally on June 8th, they'll be at the Lyme Regis Fossil Festival, also in the UK. And I'm sure there are many more dates to come.
Oh, there definitely are. So keep an eye out.
And not just in the UK, they'll be all around the world. So
I think quite a few in the US.
Yeah, and Canada, I'm pretty sure.
Yes, so very exciting. Congrats to you both and to the whole team of Why Dinosaurs. And now on to our dinosaur of the day, Bradycneme, which was a request from PaleoMike716 via our Patreon and Discord, so thanks. Bradycneme was a theropod dinosaur that lived in the Late Cretaceous in what is now Transylvania, Romania, found in the Holotype Basin with all the dwarf dinosaurs. It was named from a partial lower right leg. The type and only species is Bradycneme draculae.
That's such a good species name.
Yes, that comes from the Romanian word dracul, which means evil one and refers to Dracula, in case that sounded familiar. It was named in 1975 by C.J.O. Harrison and C.A. Walker. They named both Bradycneme and Heptasteornis, and they thought that Bradycneme was a large owl when they named it. The fossils, even though they didn't name it till 1975, those fossils were found in 1923 by Lady Smith-Woodward. It was in fairly good condition, but small areas were crushed. The holotype's almost 4 centimeters, or about 1.5 inches wide. If it were an owl, it would have been stout.
So that width basically tells you the thickness of the leg bone.
Mm-hmm. And it would have been a very large owl standing at over 6 feet or about 2 meters tall. Before it was thought to be an owl, both Bradycneme and Heptasteornis were assigned to the bird Elopteryx nopcsai, which might be a troodontid. Elopteryx was named in 1913 based on half of a femur, a thigh bone, and then other bones were referred to it, including the bone now assigned to Bradycneme. Over the years, Bradycneme has been split and synonymized with Heptasteornis and Elopteryx. And all of these splits and lumpings and everything, they're all based on, like all 3 of them are based on fragmentary fossils, all parts of the leg. So I could see why it gets confusing. The Catalog of Fossil Birds in 1978 wrote, quote, "The holotype had been doubtfully referred to Elopteryx by Andrews, 1913, but it almost certainly represents a theropod dinosaur," end quote. which I guess doesn't change too much if you think it was an owl.
Yeah, that's a theropod dinosaur.
Yeah. But anyway.
Not what they were going for, though.
When it was thought to be Elopteryx, they thought it was a pelicaniform bird, which are medium to large aquatic birds.
Like a pelican?
Yes. And then, of course, 1975, they thought it was an owl, and for a while it was thought to be one of the oldest owls known. They described it as a large owl, quote, much larger than any described species.
Yeah, it was 6 feet tall. That's a big owl.
Yeah. At other times, though, Bradycneme was thought to be a troodontid. So yeah, lots of confusion here. It has ankle bones similar to tetanurans. Tetanurans include like tyrannosaurs, ornithomimosaurs, and birds, just to name a few. It also had some features similar to troodontids with certain grooves and shapes. Again, we're all basing this on a leg bone.
Partial leg bone.
Yeah. One study suggested that Bradycneme was similar to Deinonychus, but later studies couldn't find those similarities. In 1998, Zoltan Siskisav and Dan Grigorescu said that Bradycneme was in quotes as an informal name, partly because it has similarities with troodontids, but it had a character that made it not seem like a coelurosaur. That's the clade that includes all theropods more closely related to birds. And they said more fossils were needed, and they did find differences between Bradycneme and Elopteryx. But the latest is that Bradycneme is considered to be an alvarosaurid, like you were saying earlier, Garrett. So as an alvarosaurid, it probably walked on 2 legs and would have had very short arms. So short you'd only notice its fingers, and a long tail, a short neck, a long face with a beak, and maybe it had feathers.
It's interesting you describe it as a short neck, I guess compared to a sauropod, but I think of it as sort of like an S-curved, longish neck.
When I was looking at the pictures, I do compare it to sauropods in my mind. Good call out.
Yeah, I often think of the alvarosaurid as chest-clawed weirdos because their arms and hands are so short that it looks like their claws are just basically pointing directly out of their chest.
Mm-hmm. The genus name Bradycneme means massive leg or heavy leg. Again, it's named based on its leg. And again, that species name, draculae, refers to Dracula. Bradycneme lived on an island with a lot of rivers and lakes. Some other animals that lived around the same time and place include amphibians, turtles, crocodiliforms, lizards, mammals, and pterosaurs, including a big predator one, Elopteryx. Some other dinosaurs that lived around the same time and place include the armored nodosaur Struthiosaurus, the small sauropod Magyarosaurus, and theropods, including, of course, Elopteryx and Heptasteornis. And you can learn a lot more details about all of these dinosaurs and the island they lived on in episode 400. That was our milestone episode, all about Hatzeg Island.
That's a cool one. And I remember thinking when learning about this dinosaur that the fact that it was owl-like kind of came full circle with a recent study saying that alvarosaurids might have had owl-like hearing.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a fun little connection that it sort of came all the way back around.
Yeah, they weren't totally off.
I mean, they kind of were because they were basing it on a leg. But well, yeah.
It's hard.
You can be right for the wrong reasons.
It's hard to know much from a leg.
Yeah.
From a part of a leg.
And our fun fact of the day, again, is that the fact that dinosaurs have feathers is good evidence that they were warm-blooded. I was recently reminded of that fact by a 1999 paper about the alvarosaurid Shibuya. I don't remember how I got into this paper. I was just browsing the internet and ended up reading a research paper about Shibuya from 1999.
As you do.
Yeah, as I do. This paper was written by Mary Schweitzer and others and published in the Journal of Experimental Zoology, again, about 25 years ago. And the way they put it was, quote, "The only organisms today that possess epidermally derived body coverings are those with basal metabolic rates significantly above ectothermy. Demonstration of such a body covering in non-avian theropods implies that they likewise possessed a metabolic strategy above ectothermy," end quote. And again, ectothermy literally means outside heat. It's the technical term for what almost everybody else calls cold-blooded. It refers to animals like lizards that rely on the temperature outside or basking in the sun, really anything outside of their body, in order to raise their body temperature.
And give them energy to move.
Yes, you need to raise your body temperature to get certain metabolic chemistry going. It makes perfect sense that if you rely on basking in the sun to raise your body temperature, you wouldn't want insulation between you and the sun. Ectothermic animals don't have a fast enough metabolism to create enough heat on their own, so insulation wouldn't do anything. It would be pointless, just like if you were insulating something that's already at room temperature. It's not going to warm it up. It has to be something that's creating heat. When you add insulation to it, then it'll help keep the heat in. Or at least it needs to already be warmer than its environment on its own. So just the fact that we see feathers on many dinosaurs is excellent evidence that they weren't slow, lumbering, and lizard-like. It doesn't have to be an advanced feather like you see on a modern bird, though, in order for this to be true. As they described it, quote, any epidermally derived body covering is linked to that higher metabolism or warm-bloodedness. So that would include things like the fuzz that's been found on early Cretaceous compsognathid Sinosauropteryx, also the larger feathers on the Tyrannosaur Eutyrannus, all the bird-like dinosaurs, and arguably the Ceratopsian Psittacosaurus. I'm not quite sure if those quill things would qualify as body covering, but, I guess it depends on your interpretation. It also includes the alvarosaurid Shibuya.
That's a fun name to say. Shibuya.
Yeah. And it might include Bradycneme too, since that's also alvarosaurid. Shibuya is a very cool claw-chested weirdo. The bones of Shibuya are surrounded by tube-like structures that look like the center of a bird's feather, aka the rachis, but just seeing a shape that's similar in the fossil record really isn't good enough evidence to demonstrate that it's definitely a feather. So Mary Schweitzer and her co-authors investigated those structures to see if they could prove whether or not they were feathers. I shouldn't say prove, because you can't really prove stuff, but, make a good argument for, maybe I should say. So they looked at the reported feathers under a microscope, and they also analyzed their chemistry, which both led them to conclude that they were feathers. But the coolest strategy they used was a immunohistochemical study that they did. I think we might have talked about this a long time ago, but basically what they did is they took antibodies which attack alpha keratin and antibodies that attack beta keratin and mixed them in with a feather sample from Shibuya. The antibodies were stained so that when they were lit under a fluorescent light, it would be clear if the antibodies were clinging to the fossil or not. Again, antibodies, the whole purpose is for them to attack a specific chemical structure. So if a beta keratin antibody is attacking this fossil, or maybe I should just say clinging to that part of the fossil, then it's good evidence that there is that beta keratin in that spot. With both the reported Shibuya feather and a controlled duck feather, there was a little bit of reaction with the alpha keratin, but with the beta keratin, which is the chemical that makes up modern bird feathers, both of the samples lit up like a Christmas tree. This was excellent evidence that the structures in the rock around Shibuya were in fact the remnants of Mesozoic dinosaur feathers. And as a result, evidence that Shibuya was covered in feathers and therefore likely warm-blooded.
Nice. Cool study.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And Mary Schweitzer is very famous for the sort of soft tissue chemical analyses. And it's the reason why if you see any pictures or drawings or videos, really animated videos of alvarosaurids, they're almost always covered in fuzz. It's because of Shibuya. And Mary Schweitzer figuring out how to do these different tests to demonstrate that it was probably feathers surrounding the fossil.
And on that feathery note, that wraps up this episode of I Know Dino. Thank you for listening. Stay tuned. Next week, we'll be back with even more new dinosaurs because there have been a lot coming out lately. We also recently updated our resources page on our website. So if you're looking for some free resources to learn more about dinosaurs or educational worksheets, things of that nature, then head over to iknowdino.com/resources. Thanks again, and until next time.